With us for a few weeks. We'll start this morning with a question. What do you call a Christian that's not serving? Contradiction. It's a contradiction. You remembered. Awesome. Good stuff. Any of you ever have one of those now what moments? You ever have those on a regular basis? And it's not always a bad thing. I think sometimes we always look at now what moments as, well, that's horrible and that's bad. Actually, to be honest with you, sometimes they're very good. I think we've experienced some this week where you kind of go, well, now what? And sometimes in the now what's where God steps in and goes, well, now you're trusting me, so here's what, kind of a thing. And but I think we've all probably experienced those times. And maybe things were going along pretty good. And then all of a sudden you find yourself in a situation where you're not really sure what your next step's supposed to be. You just kind of go, now what? We've come this far. We've got to this point. Now what do we do? I think all of us have probably experienced that at some point or another. I can remember my first real job as a teenager was at Carl's Jr. That probably doesn't ring a bell for people outside of California. But Hardee's, you guys know what Hardee's is? Same thing. It's kind of the same thing. It's Carl's Jr. And I remember these people must have been incredibly desperate because I remember they hired me. That's proof. But 16, and I went to Carl's Jr., and I filled out an application that day, and I turned it into the manager, and the manager said, well, do you have a few minutes? I said, sure. She said, well, I'll be right back. And so, I don't know, she just breezes through, never checks the references, which probably would have been a good idea, but she doesn't. And so she says, well, do you have a moment to talk a little bit? So kind of right there on the spot, we have an interview. So she looks at the application, has an interview, and she says, well, I want you to come on back. I want you to watch an employee training video. Okay, so I kind of stepped to the back break area, and I'm sitting there kind of watching the video, and as the video's going, the video's winding up, and they hand me a uniform. And back in those days, they were this sweet polyester chocolate brown. I mean, just sweet, like nothing breathed, and they want you working by hot stuff like all day. And all I can remember, now that I think back of it years later, have you ever seen what polyester does when it gets hot? Yeah, it melts. So I just remember having melted spots like all over me because if you work near the fryer, that's just what it... And being 16 and working near the fryer, I already had enough problems with like oily glands. It was just like I was coated in this stuff on a regular basis. And so, but that's kind of what they did. They slid me the uniform, walked away, and that was it. And I went, okay, well, now what? I didn't know what station I was supposed to work at. I didn't know who was really in charge, who do I report to? How does this really run? Like when people order burgers, who's making those and what goes on them? I mean, all this kind of stuff that I needed some now what questions answered. What's interesting is a few years later, I had a similar experience at a new church. Carrie and I were starting to date, and I was going down to her church, and it was kind of like I felt welcomed and I felt a part, but I wasn't sure where I fit. I wasn't sure where I plugged in, and it was kind of like, well, now what? And I think all of us have kind of, maybe we've been there at some point. You can identify with that now what moment at some point in your life. Some of the things that we've been covering the last few weeks in our series, Improving Your Serve, are things that I had to walk through, that we all have to kind of walk through, and they're things that I still have to be reminded of when it comes to serving and to ministry. And here's what I've started to learn. Before I could really grab onto what God had called and equipped me to do, I had to understand why. Why am I supposed to serve? Because we talk about it. The last few Sundays we've been talking about, well, if you're not serving as a Christian, then you're in contradiction. Why are we supposed to serve? And God lays that out for us. And how? How do I serve and how do I do this within within a local church that I'm a part of? And what's interesting is while we kind of look at this and go, how do we do this? Jesus has this real teachable moment with his 12 disciples, his church, on the way to Jerusalem. He has this teachable moment, and he starts to teach them through some of these things. He starts to answer the why and the how. And he really doesn't even answer the what for them to a certain degree because some of that's for us. Because Brother Scott had taught a lesson years ago when I was really, really young, and he was still older than me. But he taught us... We were going back and forth the other day. You'd have to be on the inside of that conversation. But he taught us that sometimes God wants you to be a spoon, and the next time maybe it's a saucer. And that when we get kind of pigeonholed and we say, well, I'm the spoon, in some senses we become unmoldable. And we sang a song this morning that said, hey, change my heart. You're the potter. I'm the clay. I'm here for you to mold me and make me to what you need me to be. And sometimes we get stuck in this rut of, well, I've been a plate, I've always been a plate, I will forever be a plate. And God kind of goes, well, I'll put you on the shelf because that's not what I need from you. And if you're not going to let me mold you to what I need from you, then I can't use you. And so Jesus has this real teachable moment, not so much about the what, but kind of the how and the why and things. And so if you have your Bibles with you, or there again, 2012 Bible app, or whatever you may have available to you, I invite you to come with me again to Matthew chapter 20. We're going to finish up this morning in our series, Improving Your Serve. And to this point, we've already touched on 3 of the 4 aspects of becoming a servant. And before we grab our 4th and final point, let's just make sure we understand what those 3 previous points were in Matthew chapter 20. So I'm going to let you kind of weigh in. Those of you that were listening, paid attention, maybe you took notes, that's awesome. What was the first aspect that Jesus kind of lays out for us in this conversation in Matthew chapter 20, beginning in about verse 17, but down through the chapter? What was the first aspect we can draw and say, hey, here's an important thing to remember when you want to become a servant? Check your motives. Check your motives, right? Verse 20 and verse 21 of Matthew chapter 20 says this. It says, then the mother of the sons of Zebedee came up to him with her sons kneeling before him. She asked him for something. And he said to her, what do you want? And she said to him, say that these 2 sons of mine are to sit, one on your right hand and one at your left in your kingdom. And Jesus basically asked Salome this incredibly important question. And sometimes we look at it was Salome that was asking it, so that's who he was actually addressing. Actually, we have to step back and remember, it was her and her sons. And so when he asked the question, what do you want? It wasn't just for her to answer. And really, almost more directly, it was James and John. Because they were the ones that kind of put mama up to it. Like, hey, see if we can get inside, see if we can get a position of power or prominence, prestige or whatever. And Jesus says, what do you want? What do you really want here? Do you want to be front and center? Is it about you, or is it about me? And that's a great place for all of us to kind of press the pause button and go, okay, wait a second. We need to check our motives. Why are we serving? Why do we want that particular role? Why do we feel like that's the place that God would have me do it? Is it about me and my ability and what I can get from it, or is it about God and what He's drawing my heart to? Is it more about me getting attention, or is it more about God getting glory? We need to. I'll be honest with you. I would recommend don't move past point 1 until you've wrestled that to the ground and pinned it down, because anything beyond that will just will take away from the service that you say you're trying to offer to God. If the motive isn't right, then the service isn't right. It won't achieve what God ultimately wants it to achieve. The second thing that Jesus kind of tells us as we think about aspects of becoming a servant, He tells us this. He says, expect difficulty. He paints a very serious picture when he asks these guys, are you able to drink the cup? He says, are you able to drink the cup that I'm about to drink? He says, do you understand what you're getting yourself into? Do you understand the difficulty and the hardship that you may have to face through this? Do you understand that when you say, I'm signing up to serve, that it's just, you're not just messing around and kind of just, this is something serious? He says, do you understand that? And not only does it tell us that it's not easy, it requires commitment, because when he said drink the cup, he meant drink it till it's dry. Don't drink it till you hit a bump in circumstance. Don't drink it till you grow tired of that. He says drink it till it's dry. Drain the cup. Drink the cup. By the way, guys, how did James and John respond to that question? Anybody know? What did they say? Yeah, in essence, they said, yeah, we can do that. We can drink the cup. Anybody find anything dramatically wrong with that response? Anybody find anything incredibly wrong with that response? What was wrong with the response? You guys participate here. Yeah, they didn't ask for clarity. They didn't go, hey, what does that mean exactly? Drink the cup. I'm not really sure we know what that is about. They didn't ask for clarity. They didn't say, yeah, Jesus, we're able through you, with you. I mean, none of that. So these guys have incredible confidence, and I'm going to be honest with you, seen more ministries take a nosedive because it rested on the confidence and the ability of the individual trying to run the ministry than in the power of our holy God. It tanked. And it didn't only tank with the person running the ministry, it sucked everybody down that was a part of it. And when it becomes about you, you better watch out. And when you think it's about your ability and your knowledge and your ingenuity and your wisdom and all this kind of stuff to push stuff forward, we better step back and go, hang on. It needs to be about God. It better be about Him, and it better be empowered by Him. Because I run out of steam, and I run out of ideas. And to be honest with you, I wake up in the morning sometimes and I don't feel like it. But through Him, we can do all things, He says. I love what He says. These guys, there's all this confidence, but it's so misplaced. They trusted in their own ability, and then Jesus actually gives them a peek into their future, and then He also helps them understand how things operate in God's kingdom. Look at verse 23 of Matthew 20. Jesus said to them, whether you realize this, and you don't even understand to what degree, you're going to drink from the cup. You guys remember that? Remember James? 10 years later, he's beheaded because of his faith. John lived to be well into his 90s, but the last several years of his life, he's isolated on an island by himself. Jesus says, you don't understand what I'm going to actually require of you. Are you still in? And then he helps them understand kind of how things work in the kingdom. He says, but to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared by my Father. And let me help you understand what that speaks to me, at least. I know there's probably layers of this we can unfold, but one of the things that God spoke to me right away was that this is a future event that Jesus just spoke about. He was speaking about a future event where God's kingdom comes into all of its glory, and God appoints, and God sets up His kingdom, and who runs what and who does what. And by the way, the idea that we're just kind of floating around playing harps is so not biblical. God's prepping you now for work He has for you later. That's what it's about. Remember that whole parable of, hey, you've been faithful in a few things, I'm going to make you ruler over many? That's kind of futuristic. I mean, it applies now, but it applies in the future. And so in a sense, what Jesus is trying to get us to understand, that a lot of the rewards and a lot of the benefits and a lot of the things that are going to come to us through serving Him won't happen right now. And we live in this instant gratification mindset, and Jesus says, that's not how it's really going to work. That's not what it's about. Matter of fact, if it's about getting instant gratification, you better check yourself before you wreck yourself and others. Number 3, put others first. Remember, James and John, because they brought this up, it caused conflict in the group. And sometimes we look at it and go, well, they were upset because those guys didn't understand what service was about. In essence, if you kind of read through the text, they're kind of upset that James and John got to Jesus first. They're kind of like, I can't believe this guy, they swooped in on me, and he brought their mommy with them, and they're just kind of like, what is the deal? And so all of a sudden, does that happen? Yeah. Welcome to church. It happens. It shouldn't happen. It shouldn't happen, but it does. And so because James and John have this self-serving, success-seeking motives, Jesus helps all of them come together, and he reframes their understanding of what it means to succeed from God's perspective. Look what Jesus says. From God's perspective, this is how we reframe success. Matthew chapter 20, verse 24. When the 10 heard about this, they were indignant with the two brothers. And that's such a polite term. They were really steamed at these guys. And Jesus, there again, we talked about this last week. Jesus did the greatest thing ever. He didn't scold James and John off to the side. He didn't take the other 10 and go, what is your deal, you guys? He brought them together. Let me share with you. The moment we start to become divisive, God's instruction to us is to come together. Even if you don't feel like it. Because I'm going to be honest with you, I think that was probably an uncomfortable huddle. Because the 10 didn't like those two at this moment. And Jesus brought them together. And you ever did that? Have you ever had that happen? I grew up with 2 younger sisters, and I remember my parents, we'd get in a little scrape every once in a while. And who was I talking about with that the other night? I think it was Chris. Yeah, we were talking about kind of in much more detail I won't go into this morning, but you could talk to my sister about it. She'd probably let you know from her perspective how mean and terrible I was. But we get into the scrapes, and I can remember my mom and dad, especially my sister is close to me in age. She's about a year younger than I am. We get into a scrape, and mom and dad would make us hold hands. Oh, I hated it. And then, you'd have to hug, and say you're sorry, you're just like, oh, okay, I hate you. And you're just like, and I can almost imagine Jesus kind of doing this, go, okay, guys, hold hands. Let's get together. And you know what? Somewhere in that was a lot of wisdom on my parents' side. They put us together even when we weren't really liked to be together because they understood God has actually put us together. I want you to understand, if you're here this morning, God has put us together. And while you may not like some things about each other, we got to love each other and encourage each other and build each other up. Right? So Jesus says, he calls them together, verse 25, and he said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. And then he says, not so with you. That's not the way things run here. Instead, he says, here's how this works. And this just blew their minds. He said, instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. And they probably went, okay, I can kind of deal with that. And whoever wants to be first, he like intensifies it, must be your slave. And we captured this idea about gaining a proper perspective this way. We said last week that our central ambition should be to minister to people, not be admired by them. That should be the heartbeat of what we do. That should be why we do what we do. It's to minister to them, not to be admired by people. That's not the thrust of why we serve. So this is where we left off last week. This is where we'll pick up real quick this morning. And so, taking this all into account, Jesus has kind of shaken our motives up. He says, it's not about you. He's told us to expect difficulties. He's challenged us to put others first. And then, if we were in that point going, okay, well, how do we do that? He offers us himself as a perfect example. He says, oh, by the way, I've got a perfect example for you to understand how you do this. So he says, here's why we do this, and now I'm going to help you understand how. And so our fourth and final aspect in becoming a servant this morning is this. Follow the example of Jesus. Follow the example of Jesus. You know, what would Jesus do? That's a great question. I always thought it was interesting, though. Unless we read in God's Word, you'll never understand what He already did. So to ask the question without researching what He did is kind of crazy, really. Well, what would Jesus do? Well, what did He do? What did He do? What has He done? And so look what Jesus says in verse 28 of Matthew 20. He says, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give His life as a ransom for many. He says, so if you're asking the question, well, Lord, how do we do that? He says, you do it just as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give His life as a ransom for many. And it tells us that Jesus is both our example and our motivation in this. He wasn't focused on keeping His position and trying to get more. I want you to, if you have a Bible, if you can turn there real quick, follow along. Philippians chapter 2. I want you to listen to what what Paul wrote about God's willingness, Jesus' willingness to leave His throne in order to serve us. Philippians chapter 2, verse 3, he says this. He says, hey, by the way, He's our example. He's our motivation. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. And he says, have this mind among yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus, who though He was in the form of God, did not count equality with God. Listen to this part. He was in the form of God. Jesus did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. It's telling us that Jesus didn't think He didn't have to be worried about hanging on to His godness, for lack of a better word. He wasn't worried about holding on to position. He wasn't worried about holding on to power. What He was worried about was you and me, and so He emptied Himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form. He humbled Himself by becoming obedient to the point of death. And then it doesn't even end there. It says, even death on a cross. And I think sometimes we don't get it, and I love that Jesus is very personal to us, and we kind of identify with Him. But I think sometimes we don't understand how degrading it was for the God of the universe to step down and put on human flesh. That was a huge demotion for God. For a holy God who was omnipresent and omnipotent and omniscient to clothe Himself in human flesh and step into our world was a huge demotion for Him. But he did it because he loved us and he was willing to serve us. And then he demonstrates the ultimate act of servanthood as he gives his own life and he pays for our sins so we can be free. He says, not only do I love them, not only will I come to them, but I'll take on the sin that is just draped around them. I will become sin so that they can become the righteousness of God through me. So if we're thinking about a standard of greatness, that's the standard. That's the standard. The standard is Jesus' willingness to serve. You want to become great? Then serve. Then serve. Anybody know who that is? The Wendy's dude. Yeah. Dave Thomas. Dave Thomas is his name. And yeah, he's the Wendy's guy. He was like the founder, and the restaurant was named after his daughter. And so he was the founder and CEO of Wendy's for years and years. And he passed away about 10 years ago. But at one point in his career, he appeared on the cover of their annual report dressed in a knee-length work apron and holding a mop and a bucket. And underneath the picture on the front of that annual report was a description written by Dave Thomas. And it said this. It said, I got my MBA long before my GED. At Wendy's, MBA does not mean Master of Business Administration. It means mop bucket attitude. See, Dave Thomas was a believer. He was a born-again Christian. And he understood what it meant to be great by serving. He understood that. So this morning, question for us, do we have a bucket theology? Do we have a bucket theology? Anybody remember what Pilate did with the bucket when it was given to him? Yeah. He had an opportunity to set Jesus free that day. And he calls for a bucket and he washes his hands of the whole thing. In Matthew, the 27th chapter, verse 24, it says this. It says, when Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. He said, I am innocent of this man's blood. It is your responsibility. Anybody remember what Jesus did with a bucket the night before this? He washed his disciples' dirty, stinking feet. There's a difference in what we do with the bucket. And the sad thing is the Pilate position, the Pilate mentality is still alive and well today, where we look at it and we pass it to somebody else and believe, well, that's not my responsibility, it's somebody else's. That's not my job, it's somebody else's. That's too low for me, that's somebody else's. Well, my husband's already kind of serving, so I don't have to help. Or my wife is already serving, so I don't have to participate. We have this Pilate mentality. We take the bucket and just pass it along. What's your bucket theology? I came across a cute but very pointed poem entitled Somebody Else. It says this. It says, there's a clever young guy named Somebody Else. There's nothing this guy can't do. He's busy from morning till way late at night, just substituting for you. You're asked to do this or you're asked to do that, and what is your reply? Get somebody else to do that job. He'll do it much better than I. So much to do in this weary old world, so much and workers so few, and somebody else is all weary and worn and is still substituting for you. There's too many people that are too content to let somebody else do it. And the problem with that is there aren't that many somebody else's out there, and the somebody else's that are out there are burned out and tired and weary and worn. What is your bucket theology? Jesus gives us a great example of what it should be. In the upper room, the night before his crucifixion, John tells us in the 13th chapter that Jesus got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. And after that, he poured into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. Anybody know what the response was to that? Do you guys remember that story? What was the response, especially from Peter? What was Peter's response to this?
He didn't want him to do it.
He didn't like it. Actually was upset about it. Why do you think Peter was so upset? Why was Peter so upset about this? He knew that was not Jesus' responsibility. He knew it. That's what upset him. He was so upset because he knew that wasn't Jesus' job. And that day and time, that job was given to the lowest servant in the household. And if a family could not afford a servant, that job was given to an early arriving guest. They would take on that role. They would take on the role of house servant, and they would do the dirty, filthy job. And remember, back in those days, they weren't walking on pavement. They were dirty roads, dusty roads. And if they got rain like we've been getting the last day or two, their feet were dirty and muddy and just grossed up. And that was the job of the lowest slave. That was the job of the lowest servant. And what's interesting is while Peter's so upset about this, not one single disciple took it upon themselves to step in and do the job. I love, Chuck Swindoll says this, and I thought it was so appropriate. Let me share this with you. He said, the room was filled with proud hearts and dirty feet. The disciples were willing to fight for a throne, but not for a towel. Wow. They wanted the positions of prestige. They wanted the upfront positions. They wanted the look at me positions. But not a single one of them would get up from their place and take over that role for Christ. They thought, well, that's not his job. But who stepped up? No one. In this humble act of service, Jesus was revealing to us that it is the role of his followers to serve like he served. He tells us that is our job. And I'm going to be really direct with you this morning. If you're not willing to pick up a mop bucket and a mop, then you're not a follower the way Christ has asked you to follow. If you believe that's below you, then you have elevated yourself above Christ himself. He tells us by example that he has shown us what it means to serve. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. And we have to be likewise. Let me share with you. You cannot serve from a distance. There was no way, back then they didn't have a pressurized hose system that the servant stands back at a distance and just sprays feet off. In order to do the work, you had to be willing to get your hands dirty. You had to be willing to get on your knees and to serve from a place of humility and service with heart that looked for nothing more than to serve the people God put you before. And if it becomes about being edified and admired, then your motivation is wrong. And I'm going to let you know this morning, as we're gearing up for new roles and new positions of ministry to start up, if you won't do the menial jobs, you don't get the other jobs. I'm just saying it. As pastor, if you won't do the menial jobs, then we will not ask you, nor will you be offered an opportunity to do something above it. If you won't serve like Jesus served, then I don't want you serving in a role you think you need to be serving in. I love you, but I'm being honest. By the way, there's 3 positions to sign up for church cleaning. I'm actually really serious. And those of you that have already done it, thank you. Who's next? Here's the thing, you guys, and I don't want this to be, pastors beating us up, but I hate them, and let's get out of here. Here's the thing, you guys, and this is why I want to share this with you, because it's so incredibly vital for you to understand this. Because it isn't even about, the service is awesome, and what you share as you share God's heart in serving is so important. But listen to this. I don't want you to think that it's kind of a no reward situation. Look what I want you to understand this, because Jesus tells us that if we'll serve like he served, you know what he tells us? Listen, be excited about this. He says you're blessed if you serve like that. John the 13th chapter, if you don't believe me, read it for yourself. John the 13th chapter, verse 17. This whole scene is unfolding. Jesus has washed these nasty feet, and he's done this whole thing. And then in verse 17, he says, now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you think about maybe, possibly signing up and helping occasionally in that. Is that what it says? Somebody help me out. What does it say? Blessed if you do them. So here, listen to this. Anybody understand? We talked about this a while back. We went through the Beatitudes. Anybody remember what the word blessed means in Scripture? Happy. Happy. So Jesus tells us that happiness comes from serving the way He served. Happiness comes that when we're doing the things that a servant does. Like what? Like managing our motives. Happiness comes when we expect difficulty and we don't quit when it comes. Happiness comes when we put others first. Happiness comes when we follow the example of Christ. Let me share with you the image of Jesus on His knees, washing dirty feet. That image never left Peter. It never left him. It stayed with him the rest of his life. That image of his Savior on His knees, washing His feet just hours before He'd be put on a cross, just stayed with Peter. He says, how can he do this? And then in the middle of this, he's so impacted that later he would write these words in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 5. Peter writes this to other followers of Christ. He says, all of you clothe yourselves with humility toward one another, because God opposes the proud and gives grace to the humble. Brother Scott talked this morning about being clothed with compassion. To be clothed, when that phrase is used, it's God telling us, you have a choice to make in this. He doesn't say, I'm clothing you with this. He says, you be clothed. You intentionally select that. You intentionally select compassion. You intentionally select service. I love what D.L. Moody would once say. He said, we may easily be too big for God to use, but we will never be too small. We can easily be too big. When it becomes about us, when it becomes about what I think and what I want, and we become too big sometimes for God to use, but you will never be too small. We've already had commitment slips coming back to us about new roles and positions of ministry, and I love that people are signing up and saying, hey, I can't do much, but I'd like to do this. You know what? There's an old song, little is much if God is in it. Little is much. If our hearts are yielded to what God is speaking to us and we want to just serve and we just want to do it for His glory, He's going to bless that. He's going to bless the people you serve, and He's going to bless you in the serving. So back to the question, what kind of bucket theology do you have? Pilate used his bucket to avoid responsibility. Jesus used his bucket to take on responsibility. If we call ourselves Christ followers, then we shouldn't be looking for ways to wash our hands. We should be looking for ways to get our hands dirty. We should be looking for ways to get our hands dirty. Because there's people around us, there's people in our community that need us to get our hands dirty, that need us to be Christ's hands and feet. So now what? Share with you a story I came across. It said after lightning struck an old shed, a farmer was relieved because now he didn't have to tear it down. The rain cleaned off his car, and that saved him from having to wash it. And when asked what he was going to do now, he replied, I'm waiting for an earthquake to shake the potatoes out of the ground. If we want to become servants, you don't just wait around for something to happen. You actually do something. He said, blessed are you if you do this. Not wait around, not sit and look, not shrink into the shadows and go, well, I think somebody else can take care of that. I told you about my now what experience in a new church many years ago. And what I learned was that my perspective needed to change a little. Instead of asking the church to make a way for me to belong, I began praying to God, God, show me where I need to serve. Instead of asking the church to make a way for me to just fit in, I asked God, I want you just to somehow use me. And I don't know what that means. And so in the process, God taught me some things, and I want to share with you as we close this morning 4 action steps that God has I think are just solid, and I want to pass this on to you this morning if you're thinking about, well, now what? Here's the now what. First, serve whenever you can. Serve whenever you can. And I know for some of you guys, well, I'd like to do this, but my schedule. That's okay. but I'm pretty convinced that there's somewhere in your schedule where you have an opportunity to do something, to serve in some capacity. Serve. Serve there. And say, well, the only opportunity I just have is like, it's a Thursday morning thing. Okay. There's a lot of things that happen that happen off-site, that happen even here, that take place through the week, that doesn't necessarily have to happen on a Sunday or a Wednesday. It's just stuff that happens. Second, serve wherever you can. Serve whenever you can. Serve wherever you can. I think a lot of times we're always hesitant because, like, well, we're waiting for this perfect opportunity. If you're waiting for a perfect opportunity, let me share with you, to serve, it will never come along. If you're waiting for a perfect opportunity, it will never come along. Serve wherever you can. Look around. Here's another one. Serve whoever is in need. Look at the needs. Let your heart be broken for people in need and serve there. I love the writer, Jeremiah, the prophet, would write in Lamentations chapter 3. He said, my eye affects my heart. He says, what I've seen affected me, and because it did, I plugged in. I prayed fervently. I did something. I became a part. I had compassion. I was moved beyond sympathy. I was moved beyond empathy. I was moved to the point to action. And that's what compassion is. That's why God was so great. That's why Jesus was so great at serving, because he understood that compassion moves us to action. Last but not least, be willing to do whatever it takes. Do what it takes. I'm going to close this morning with some words from Richard Foster. He wrote a book called The Celebration of Discipline. Let me share with you some pretty powerful words. He says, self-righteous service comes through human effort. True service comes from the whispered promptings of Christ. Self-righteous service is impressed with the big deal. True service finds it almost impossible to distinguish between the small and the large. Self-righteous service requires external rewards. True service rests in hiddenness. Self-righteous service picks and chooses whom to serve. True service is indiscriminate in its ministry. Self-righteous service is affected by moods and whims. True service ministers simply and faithfully because there's a need. Self-righteous service is temporary. True service is a lifestyle. Self-righteous service fractures community. True service builds community. This morning, let's be real, true servants of our great God and King. Let me ask you this morning as we close, what's a Christian called that's not serving? Contradiction. Don't be a contradiction. Be a Christian. Be a Christ follower. We're going to sing a verse. Brother Steve, if you got something selected, and we'll close this morning.